Gandhi's Passion: The Life and Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 4: Brief Interlude at Home. But first he returned to Rajkot, setting up his own office there, drafting applications and memorials brought to him primarily by his brother's partner. He barely earned as much at such drudgery, however, as his father's salary had been decades earlier. It was hardly the sort of life young Gandhi had dreamed of when shivering in Victoria, starving in Richmond, or declaiming to his vegetarian society in Bayswater. The barren boredom of reading and drafting reams of legal plate in mercantile memorials made him wish he had never come home. Then, one day, his brother asked him to put in a word on his behalf with the British political agent, Sir Edward Charles Ollivant, the Viceroy's representative in the princely states of Rajkot and Potbandar. Lakshmi Das had been accused of advising the young Rana of Rajkot to remove some of that state's precious jewels from its treasury without the requisite prior permission of the British agent. The myth of princely state independence had long been understood by India's 570 puppet potentates as a political shadow game played to help each state's subjects remain calm and loyal. Those hereditary native princes enjoyed their palatial comforts and pleasures only as long as they never conspired against British suzerain power. British martial leaders and Western weapons had trained Indian soldiers to crush and conquer all of South Asia's princes over the past century, even after the Sepoy Mutiny, which had launched the last great Anglo Indian War of 1857. British officers were then sent by Victoria's Viceroy from Calcutta to reside at every Indian prince's court, men like Sir Edward. With British troops under their command, these officers were ready to blow away any prince or his advisers foolish enough to ignore orders or venal enough to try to liquidate the state's valuable treasures without prior permission from the agent, who was, in fact, the real sovereign. Mohandas had briefly met Ollivant in London and naturally mentioned it to his brother, who considered that trifling acquaintance to influence the mighty British agent in this embarrassing matter of purloined princely jewels. Barrister Gandhi, of course, understood that if his brother was innocent, he hardly needed any influence to exonerate himself, but should simply submit a petition. Lakshmi Das, however, had not spent as much as he had on his brother's travel and education merely to be told that the family barrister could be of no use in so vital a matter. So, despite misgivings, Gandhi felt obliged to ask for and indeed was quickly granted an appointment to meet with Rajkot's shadow monarch. 48 years old, Ollivant was a big man and a busy one, having taken up his white man's burden of high office and grave imperial responsibility a quarter century earlier. He had no illusions about any of the natives he met, harbored little expectation of thanks from the princes he managed, and enjoyed no sense of humor or great pleasure in the daily work he did with earnest self righteousness. Your brother is an intriguer, he told Gandhi, who had barely started his argument. I want to hear nothing more from you. I have no time. Then he stood up, towering above the tiny barrister, whose single virtue, of course, was that he dressed like an Englishman. Gandhi refused to believe that his audience was over. He had been given more time in the palace of Cardinal Manning. He had loomed, after all, with Dr. Josiah Oldfield. His vegetarian friends had hosted an elegant and very well attended farewell dinner in his honor in one of London's finest restaurants, and the vegetarian had published no fewer than 7 of his articles. How could this political agent be so peremptory in dismissing him? Surely good English manners dictated more dignified patience. Pleading to be heard out, Mohan was instead shown to the door. Ollivant called his peon, who placed his hands on my shoulders and put me out. The Sahib went away, and I departed fretting and fuming. It was the most humiliating experience of his life since he had left London. Much like the curse of his father's death, this violent expulsion from Ollivant's office instantly altered the glowing image he had painted in his mind of English honor, justice, good manners, and friendly behavior. You have insulted me, he wrote at once to Sir Edward. You have assaulted me through your peon. If you make no amends, I shall have to proceed against you. Mohan was outraged, mad enough to rise in court himself and shout those words seared into his mind by the agent's voice and his peon's hot hands. Insult and assault. Clearly, such gross conduct must be actionable. Yet Ollivant's swift written answer sounded even colder than his voice had to Gandhi's sensitive ears. You were rude to me. I asked you to go and you would not. I had no option but to order my peon to show you the door. He therefore had to use just enough force to send you out. You are at liberty to proceed as you wish. I had heard what a British officer was like, Gandhi later confessed in his autobiography, but up to now had never been face to face with one. It had proved a rude awakening. But for his years in London, Mohan Das should never have approached so exalted an officer, at least not for any favour. Yet travelling to and from England had taught him how kind, gentle, gracious, and generous English men and women were to everyone, everywhere except in India. The Raj seemed to turn some of those same human beings into despots and monsters. No Englishman ever spoke so harshly, so rudely to him in their own domain. It was doubly humiliating to hear one speak to him this way in his own home state. Ollivant never imagined, of course, how much he personally did to help convert a timid barrister, deeply loyal to Great Britain's imperium, into India's greatest revolutionary nationalist leader. Gandhi's impotent fury and rage at Ollivant's rudeness was, moreover, compounded by his own understanding of how wrong he had been to approach such an official, such a false position. He knew that his brother had been wrong, at least according to the rules of the game created and enforced by foreign empires. He had learned enough merely from dining at the Inner Temple about British vicious mentality to intuit that when his brother first asked him for the favor, it was doomed to failure. But he was Indian enough not to be able to refuse an elder brother's request. Sir Feroze Shah Mehta, the uncrowned king of Bombay, whose wealth and were much greater than those of most English officials, came by sheer coincidence to Rajkot shortly after Mohan Das's rude expulsion from Ollivant's office. If Gandhi would earn something and have an easy time here, Mehta advised, let him tear up the note and pocket the insult. He will gain nothing by proceeding against the Sahib, and will very likely ruin himself. It was the first time Gandhi ever solicited advice from Sir Feroze Shah Mehta, and he chose not to follow it. He did not tear up Ollivant's note, nor did he pocket the insult, nurturing it instead trying to make some sense of such arrogance and irrational contempt on the part of a single representative of one national entity for every member of another, much larger, much older, much more civilized nation. This shock changed the course of my life, Gandhi reflected. He was still indebted to Lakshmi Das, but he had now learned that he could never pay off that debt as his elder brother might wish him to. Speaking the Queen's English and wearing proper English clothes had not sufficed to shield him from humiliation or from the rough, dirty hands of an illiterate peon who mastered neither English nor Latin and would never be called to any bar. The insult he'd sustained less than a year after having returned from England searingly convinced Gandhi that he could never be content to live out his life in the provincial princely backwater to which he had been born. He had seen too much of the wider, greater world to rest content in the shadow of impotent, indigenous royalty and arrogant foreign despots, served by stooges who included his own brothers and countless other peons, ready to do anything the Sahib ordered. He, Olivant, could have politely asked me to go, Gandhi reflected, unable to stop thinking or writing about this dramatic incident. But power had intoxicated him to an inordinate extent. Most of my work would naturally be in his court. It was beyond me to conciliate him. Princes were always at the mercy of others and ready to lend their ears to sycophants. Even the Sahib's peon had to be cajoled. Here, the Sahib's will was the law. I was exasperated. Anxious to escape, Gandhi would have jumped at any opportunity of gainful employment virtually anywhere other than Rajkot. Just at this time, his brother learned from a Memon Muslim merchant friend that the firm of Dada Abdullah and Company needed a barrister to handle a big case for them in South Africa. They were offering first class passage to and from Natal and all living expenses paid for 1 year's stay as well as a fee of £105. This was hardly going there as a barrister, but I wanted somehow to leave India, Gandhi noted. I closed without any hingling and got ready to go to South Africa. So, in April of 1893, less than 2 years after returning home, the 23-year-old barrister set sail again, destined this time for Durban and his own rebirth to a career of community service and a life of religious and political leadership. Chapter 5: Early Traumas and Triumphs in South Africa. When starting for South Africa, I did not feel the wrench of separation I had experienced when leaving for England, Gandhi confessed. I only felt the pang of parting with my wife. Another baby had been born to us. We are bound to meet again in a year, I said to her by way of consolation. Their second son, Manilal, had been born in October 1892, barely 6 months before Gandhi so cavalierly steamed off again from Bombay, leaving him and their 4-year-old Harilal at home in Rajkot. Gandhi was no more of a chauvinist than most of his equally affluent Indian contemporaries, nor was he any less. Though Gandhi prided himself on having become his wife's teacher and guide, he also admitted that our love could not yet be called free from lust. Kasturba may well have felt more relieved to see him go than he was eager to be off again. Dada Abdullah, Natal's wealthiest Gujarati merchant, was waiting on the quay in Durban to welcome Gandhi, personally taking his frock coat clad white elephant, as Gandhi later called himself, to his firm's warehouse office building. Indian coolie labor, mostly indentured Tamils from the south, had since 1860 been shipped to work on that garden colony's tea and sugar plantations as virtual slaves. After their 5 year indenture contracts expired, they could sail home free or stay in South Africa. Most Indians chose to remain, many drifting north from Natal's colony to the Republic of Transvaal. Gujarati merchants had quickly followed the poor laborers and prospered by selling them every variety of good, from cottons to pots and matches. Natal's white rulers watched the growing influx of Indians, who by 1893 slightly outnumbered them, with alarm, anger, and racist revulsion. A week after reaching Durban, Gandhi was sent by his employer to Pretoria in the Transvaal to meet his solicitor there and to discuss the case against Dada Abdullah's merchant cousin, Tayyab Haji Khan Muhammad. He was to travel first class by train, and since it was a long journey, he had brought his own bedroll. The train reached Pittsburgh station at around 9 p.m. when another passenger entered Gandhi's compartment. He looked me up and down. He saw that I was colored. Out he went and came in again with two officials. They told Gandhi to go to the van compartment where all the coolies were. He refused to budge. They searched for a constable who pushed me out. My luggage was also taken out. I refused to go to the other compartment and the train steamed away. Then he spent a long cold night seated in the waiting room of that empty station, thousands of miles from home. Should I fight for my own rights or go back to India? Or should I go on to Pretoria without minding the insults? Gandhi recalled, reflecting. He decided it would be cowardice to run back to India without fulfilling my obligation. No peon this time, but a constable had assaulted him, and the reason for this expulsion was much more heinous than Ollivant's rude impatience. The British agent, who had been impolite and short tempered, was Gandhi knew quite right in rejecting his attempt to use influence on behalf of his guilty brother. The indignity to which he had been so violently subjected in Natal, however, was a symptom of the deep disease of color prejudice. Gandhi had to travel to South Africa to experience one of life's meanest, most irrational prejudices. Reared as he was in princely India, a child of privilege and power, enjoyed as he had Christian friendship and support in England, but for the single trauma he'd sustained at the hands of Ollivant and his peon, Gandhi might have escaped racial prejudice for the rest of his life had he not taken this job in Africa. The arrogance of British imperial officials paled beside that of white Afrikaner settlers and their police. His youth once again inspired him to resolve to fight rather than run or silently swallow such insults to his dignity and human rights. I should try, if possible, to root out the disease of color prejudice and suffer hardships in the process. Redress for wrongs I should seek only to extent that would be necessary. He took the next train to Pretoria after wiring the general manager of the railway as well as his employer. Dada Abdullah met with the manager, but the latter stood by his guards. Abdullah also alerted his friends and relatives, however, all along the line, urging them to help Gandhi in every possible way. All those kind friends who awaited him tried to comfort him by telling Gandhi similar tales of prejudice they had suffered and opted meekly to accept, much as Mehta had advised him to do in Rajkot. Had he been older, meeker, or more interested in enjoying an easy time of it and earning more money, Gandhi could have silently lowered his head and kept his mouth shut. But that was hardly young barrister Gandhi's idea of how to deal with injustice. He could, however, take a more pragmatic approach when he saw that one of his just demands would not be met. The next day, in fact, after the train took him to Charlestown, he was obliged to board a stagecoach to Johannesburg, since no track had yet been laid there. His first class ticket entitled him to a comfortable seat inside the coach, but the white man in charge ordered him to sit on the side of the coach box instead. I knew it was sheer injustice and an insult, but I thought it better to pocket it. I could not have forced myself inside, and if I had raised a protest, the coach would have gone off without me. The loss of another day. So much as I fretted within myself, I prudently sat next to the coachman. Still flexible enough to bend, Gandhi was willing to stoop only so far in accommodating racist despotism. When that same white man decided he wanted to taste the fresh air from Gandhi's seat, calling him me for Swami, as ordered him to come down to the footboard, the insult was more than I could bear. Trembling, I said to him, I will not, but I am prepared to sit inside. The bully boxed his ears and tried to drag me down, but Gandhi tenaciously clung to the brass rails, determined to keep my hold even at the risk of breaking my wrist bones. His courage and fierce resolve aroused the sympathy of other passengers, who denounced the bully and invited Mohandas to sit next to them inside. Shamed by such human shouts, the bully let him be, banishing a Hottentot servant from the coach box instead, while Gandhi sat silently, praying to God to help me. At the next stop, Dada Abdullah's friends were waiting to take him quickly to comfort and safety for the night. He wrote the coach company to complain of his treatment on their vehicle and was assured a good seat in the larger coach that took him the next day to Johannesburg. In busy Johannesburg, however, Gandhi missed Dada Abdullah's agent, so took a cab to the Grand National Hotel and asked for a room. The manager eyed me for a moment. I'm very sorry, we are full up. So he told his cab driver to take him to Abdullah's friend's shop and found them expecting him, enjoying a good laugh when they learned he had asked for a hotel room. Only we can live in a land like this because for making money we do not mind pocketing insults. The smiling Muslim merchant explained, this country is not for men like you. He advised Gandhi to travel third class to Transvaal. But the haughty barrister was not as yet a Mahatma, insisting on the first class ticket he'd been promised. Abdullah's friend did as requested but warned, I'm afraid the guard will not leave you in peace. Sure enough, a guard came to order him to third class. This time, however, an English passenger accompanied him in the first class coach. What do you mean by troubling the gentleman? He said. Don't you see he has a first class ticket? I do not mind in the least his travelling with me. To which the bigoted guard muttered, if you want to travel with a coolie, what do I care? So Gandhi journeyed to Pretoria in comfort. No one awaited him at Pretoria station, which he reached quite late on a Sunday. Afraid to go alone to any hotel and unsure of where to spend the night, he was approached by an American Negro who offered to take him to Johnston's family hotel near the station. Mr. Johnston agreed to rent him a room for the night. What exactly had brought Gandhi's American helper to Pretoria in 1893 remains uncertain, though he may have been connected with the Ethiopian church movement. Thus, the first man to greet and assist Gandhi in Pretoria was an African American who took him to a hotel run by a man who instantly reassured Gandhi that I have no color prejudice. The next morning, Gandhi went to Abdullah's Pretoria solicitor, A.W. Baker, who first of all told him there was really no work for a barrister in this matter, then worked very hard at trying to convert him to his own Christian faith. I'm a Hindu by birth, Gandhi answered, and yet I do not know much about Hinduism. I should not think of embracing another religion before I fully understand my own. As a director of South African General Mission, Baker devoted most of his time and energy to building a church in Pretoria where he preached every afternoon and invited Gandhi to attend his prayer meetings. More important than the missionary Christian contacts Gandhi made in Pretoria, however, was his awakening to the Indian community there and to the role he might play in helping to organize and activate them. Dada Abdullah's wealthy disputant Tayyab Haji Khan, the acknowledged leader of Pretoria's Indian merchant, liked Gandhi at first meeting and invited him to address all the leading Indian merchants in the Transvaal at a meeting held in the spacious house of Haji Muhammad Haji Yusuf. In the first public speech in my life, Gandhi talked about the racial discrimination he'd observed and experienced and urged his listeners always to be truthful in business to improve their sanitary habits and to forget debilitating caste and religious distinctions, which generally weakened the community in its struggle for justice and equality with whites. I suggested in conclusion the formation of an association to make representations to the authorities in respect of the hardships of the Indian settlers. He made a considerable impression on his audience and during the discussion that followed, offered to teach his new friends the English language. Though he'd come to work as a barrister, he thus early began to transform himself into a community leader and a teacher. Satisfied with the result of that meeting, Pretoria's Indian community leaders decided to hold such meetings weekly, and soon Gandhi found no Indian I did not know, which prompted me in turn to make the acquaintance of the British agent, who agreed to help us as best as he could. Next, Gandhi wrote to the railway manager to inform him that from his careful study of the railway regulations, he saw no reason why properly dressed Indians who purchased first and second class tickets should not be allowed to ride in those carriages. The manager agreed to leave it up to the station master to decide who was properly dressed. Gandhi, the patiently persistent agitator negotiator, was thus well on his way to becoming the spokesman for Indian merchant interests. He inched his way one step at a time toward finding remedies to inequities, first for the elite Indian community, later for the entire community, including its lower class ex indentured workers. He had thought of returning home by the end of 1 year or even a bit earlier, but God disposed otherwise. South Africa became his proving ground, the launching pad for Gandhi's rise to premier leadership of its immigrant Indian community during the next 2 decades. By the time he would return permanently to India, he would have totally transformed himself in dress and manner of daily life, as well as in thought, speech, and ultimate goal. Unrecognizable to those who once thought they knew him, the frock coated white elephant would be reborn a Mahatma. First, however, he resolved to settle the legal dispute that had lured him to South Africa. Gandhi's mind had never been predisposed to the fiercely disputatious side of legal argument. He favored the resolution of conflict through negotiation rather than litigation whenever possible. The traditional Hindu proclivity to find consensus in social and political affairs as well as religio philosophic argument was the matrix of Gandhi's approach to legal problems. Dada Abdullah's suit was for the substantial sum of £40,000, which he claimed was owed to him based on promissory notes and the failure of specific performance by his merchant cousin, who was equally convinced that he had done nothing improper. After hearing both parties argue their points, Gandhi was convinced that the case would take years to litigate, costing a fortune in legal fees. He advised arbitration, and soon Afterward, an arbitrator was appointed.